part of Unity's first basic principle. And that is that there's one presence, there's one power, there's one reality. And we call that reality God. And so this is our true nature, which is wholeness itself. And we express that. And that's really the fundamental teaching of all the mystical traditions, is that there's one. There's only one. In the Buddhist tradition, they talk about the 10,000 things, but those are all just in form, and in truth, there's only one, and we are an expression of that one. So what the Course in Miracles says is, as we accept miracles, we are accepting our state of wholeness, and we're affirming the truth about ourselves. That is the essence of who we are. So we don't need another person, place, or thing to complete ourselves in any way. We are absolutely whole right now. And our only job is to recognize that. So when I was in Santa Maria, and I was retiring from Santa Maria, on the last Sunday that I spoke there, I rather presumptuously titled my talk, "The Last Sermon That You'll Ever Need to Hear." And the theme of that was that you'll never be closer to God than you are right now. You'll never be closer to God than you are right now. Breathe with me. Just be in that presence and know the truth of who you are right now. You'll never be closer to God than you are right now. So now, so wholeness, because wholeness really takes of that that divinity, God. There is from the human perspective that mystery about it, because there are some things from our human perspective that we just don't grok, we just don't get. And so there's this mystery. And so when we think about wholeness, there's also this kind of element of mystery. Because, I mean, as we look out in the heavens and we see this infinite universe, when we turn our gaze inward, we have that same kind of infinite depth. And so there's this kind of mystery to wholeness as well. I want to show you an image here that I like. So this is an image I like that kind of, for me, expresses wholeness. And so there we see this person who lives in this human kind of consciousness with the sun and the trees and all of that, and yet can move beyond that and see this bigger part of the universe that represents the divine and multi-dimensions. Here's another kind of image that I like, and what this means to me is the different spiritual traditions, a lot of them have this metaphor of there being a veil. There's being a veil between our three-dimensional form here that we live in and a deeper dimension, this dimension of the divine. And there's this very thin veil that separates the two. So it's not something that's out there, that's away from us. It's just something that is always present right now, but we're just not in touch with it. And we have at any time the capacity to penetrate this veil, as we see this little child doing here. That's why Jesus talked about having eyes to see and ears to hear, that we have the capacity to see that everything is sacred. So the only thing that separates us from God is that we think that we're separate from God. That's it. That's the only thing. In fact, in unity, That's one of the ways that we define sin, is that we think we're separate. We think that we're separate from God. And that, friends, is sinful or error kind of thinking. The truth is, of course, that we're never separate, as I have already said. So we can think about this human experience as our soul, which is always connected to God or source, incarnates into this three-dimensional material world. And then we have this transformation of consciousness and grow into this consciousness of oneness, and we're rejoined with this experience of source, and we can experience this and not just have this awareness. So that's part of our human experience here, is to become aware of who we truly are. And so our soul knows that we are an expression of the divine in the deepest possible way. So that's where this idea of psychotherapy and spiritual practice come in. So to express wholeness, we need to encompass all aspects of our experience. And of course, there are many forms of psychotherapy, many forms of spiritual practice. And so what I want to focus on, what is relevant to us in terms of how we express wholeness. So traditionally, it's in the East where spiritual practice has been emphasized with much less emphasis, if anything at all, with our psychological development. And the reverse is true in our modern West, which in mainstream is very much a secular kind of culture. And so what has been emphasized is psychological development as the highest expression of human development. And so for a lot of people, we think that when we're psychologically whole and fully mature and expressed, that's as high as it goes. But one of the things that we can see as a common denominator between psychotherapy and spiritual practice is that virtually every form of each one of them has a theme of know thyself. Whether it's psychotherapy or whether it's spiritual practice, from both of these disciplines, we have this notion of knowing ourselves in the deepest way possible. Another common denominator between the two is impulse containment. And that is that both psychotherapy and spiritual practice encourage us to be aware of and to act out in a very conscious, clear intention on what our desires are and what our motivation is, what our impulses are, so that we just don't habitually and reflexively react to whatever comes to mind, but that we do that in a very conscious sort of way. So that's something else that psychotherapy and spiritual practice have in common. Now, one of the biggest differences between psychotherapy and spiritual practice is the nature of the self that is being considered. So in psychotherapy, the concept of self usually refers to our personal self, our individuated, self-conscious individual self. And so we could say that psychotherapy is designed to strengthen the ego. And so with most spiritual practice, the self that's addressed is our transcended self, our self that's something that transcends our human individuated consciousness, our higher self or our divine self. And so the intention of spiritual practice is for us to release attachment to the ego and to realize that the ego is something that we have and it's not what we are. So in this regard, we could see these two disciplines as kind of working at cross purposes with one another. So in other words, you could have the experience of your psychotherapist is working to strengthen your ego, and your spiritual teacher is working on helping you to dissolve your ego. But if we understand the right function of the ego and the relationship between the two disciplines, this becomes clearer to us. And that is, we need a healthy ego to function in the world, and yet the ego is ultimately not who we are. So psychotherapy can help us heal and strengthen our ego, and spiritual practice can help us realize that we are more than the ego. So we can think about our ego as our best friend and our worst enemy. It's our friend in the sense that through it, it's our vehicle for expression in this human experience. And as we know ourselves, and as we allow ourselves to individuate, that is to express ourselves at the deepest level, we allow spirit to work through us so that we're really this tremendous expression of love and harmony and peace and joy. And we really allow ourselves to do that. In addition, it means that the ego can make choices that facilitate our really seeing who we truly are. The ego, by the same token, is our worst enemy because we tend to get over-identified with our ego, and that really holds us back from being the full expression of who we are. So I want to share with you some of my personal experiences with both psychotherapy and spiritual practice. So in my lifetime, I've had several courses. I'll just refer to the psychotherapy as counseling. So I was married for over 20 years, and my first marriage ended in divorce. And the way that happened, or one of the things that happened, was my wife had an affair. And so when I learned about that, I was really devastated, just heartbroken. My world just crumbled around me. It was really very painful for me. And so I went to see a therapist, and he was very helpful. And so one of the things that he had me do was to write letters to my wife and her partner. And I can assure you, those letters were filled with venom, but it allowed me to release some of that. So in addition, he taught me a forgiveness practice. And so it's one that Stephen Levine uses, but it's about having an image in your mind of this person that you want to forgive, and that you gradually, increasingly tell them in a deeper and more sincere way that I forgive you. And so I would do that every day, and I would cry and cry and cry. And I'd do it again the next day and cry and cry and cry. But what I learned was that if you stick with it and you cry enough, you can eventually come to peace with what's happened, and come to peace with yourself. And so I hung in there, and I did that, and so now my former wife and I have a very lovely relationship that we've had for many years, and so we can share our daughter and the times we're together with great joy now. And so that's something that I am very happy about and that celebrate. So the next experience I had with psychotherapy was I was in ministerial school, and the school actually paid for me to go see a therapist. And I thought that was really cool. In fact, in the 8 years that I was at Unity Village and during the 2 years that I was in school, ministerial school. This experience with this therapist was one of the most important for me. And based on recommendations from one of my ministerial teachers, I went to a Gestalt therapist who was fairly well known in the Kansas City area, and I went to him for quite some time. And he used a process called empty chair therapy, which is simply that if you've got someone that you've got an issue with, you can dialogue with them in an empty chair. And so for me, it was a lot of work with my mother, who had a huge impact in my life. And so I saw him regularly for several months, and during the course of that time, particularly in one rather emotional episode, towards the end of that, he where I'd been working with the empty chair, and of course imagining my mother sitting in the other chair, he kind of suggestively said to me, so what would you like to do to your mother? And I got up out of my chair and I picked up a pillow that was nearby and I smashed it, and it flipped over. And I noticed that he seemed kind of pleased about that. So anyway, I was so grateful that the school had the insight to realize that I needed, and anybody who wants to be a minister or any kind of spiritual teacher or leader, which is really all of us. I mean, we're all teachers and we're all leaders in our own way. You really need to work through our psychological wounds. And so the way that I think about psychotherapy is, and that really aligns with New Thought and with what Unity teaches, is the way that Jung expressed it. And so that we need to integrate our shadow, our wounded part of us that we deny. We need to integrate that with the rest of our consciousness. So the way that Jung puts it, unless you make the unconscious conscious, you will project that onto the events of your life, and you'll call it fate. So you may have heard the expression that we don't see the world as it is, but we see the world as we are. And so I have here an example of that. So you can see that this poor guy is projecting onto the shadow something that is really something that he's enjoying and attracted to. But this is something that we need to become aware of. And that awareness is so critical. Eckhart Tolle says, awareness is the greatest agent of change. Awareness is the greatest agent of change. And so we become aware of what we're denying and what is unconscious. So even if you don't go to formal psychotherapy and to see a counselor, there are still any number of ways that you can increase your self-awareness. One of those is journaling. And so journaling and self-reflection is very, very useful to really increase our self-awareness and to make the unconscious conscious. So what we want to cultivate is this idea of the witness, of the neutral observer, so that we can see ourselves as we really are. And that's a challenging, difficult process, because the ego is the master of self-deception. But I can assure you, if you take the time to cultivate this way of seeing yourself, you'll see that you might not be, you might not have all the wonderful qualities that you like to think that you have, and that you do have some opportunities for growth. So I want to share now about spiritual practice, and how that's played a role in my life, and how I frame that and see that in a new thought unity kind of framework. So as with psychotherapy, there are many kinds of spiritual practice, but every spiritual tradition has some kind of mindfulness meditation or some kind of contemplative prayer. And even our mainstream secular culture has become really enamored with this idea of mindfulness. And so that's a really, in my view anyway, that's a very positive thing. And I think a way that we being the human family and human consciousness, of really transforming our consciousness. So I want to share with you a little video here.
You may have heard this word mindfulness. It's become something of a buzz phrase of late. So I'm going to give you one simple, serviceable definition, which is this. Mindfulness is the ability to know what's happening in your head at any given moment without getting carried away by it. Imagine how useful this could be. Just as an example, driving down the road and somebody cuts you off in traffic. How do you normally react? I think most of us, we normally react by having a thought, which is, I'm pissed. And then what happens next? You immediately, habitually, reflexively inhabit that thought. You actually become pissed. There's no buffer between the stimulus and your reaction. With just a little bit of mindfulness, in that same situation, you might notice my chest is buzzing, my ears are turning red, I'm having a starburst of self-righteous thoughts, I'm getting angry. But you don't necessarily have to act on it and chase that person down the road, scream at them with your kids in the back of the car thinking you've done nothing. Now, you might be thinking, don't I need to get angry sometimes? Aren't I justified? I would say yes, but probably not as much as you think. The proposition here is not that you should be rendered by mindfulness into some lifeless, non-judgmental blob. The proposition is that you should learn how to respond wisely to things that happen to you rather than just reacting blindly. And that, my friends, is a superpower. How do you get it? The way to get it is through meditation. I believe that meditation and mindfulness are the next big public health revolution. In the 1940s, if you told somebody you were going running, they would have said, who's chasing you? But then what happened next? The scientists swooped in, they showed that physical exercise is really good for you, and now all of us do it, and if we don't, we feel guilty about it. And that's where I think we're headed with mindfulness and meditation. It's going to join the pantheon of no-brainers like brushing your teeth, eating well, and taking the meds your doctor prescribed for you. Let me just close by saying, mindfulness is not going to solve all of your problems. It's not going to render your life a nonstop parade of unicorns and rainbows. Nonetheless, this is a superpower, and one that is accessible by you immediately.
So I think when I see this kind of video, and that meditation is being promoted in such a broad way, it gives me great hope that I think that we really are embracing this transformation that I think that the human family and human consciousness is going through, and it's very hopeful. So for me personally, I actually became a meditator before I was on a unity path. And that was because, as he said about the scientists, there was research that was done, a lot of it done in the 70s and 80s, that research on meditators, particularly a lot of monks and stuff, that showed that it was really a very positive thing to do. And so even before I was on a conscious spiritual journey, I was doing some meditation. And then when I was in ministerial school, one of my teachers actually led a Buddhist Sangha right there on the campus that I became a part of. And I developed a practice of regularly meditating. And our little group we had our own retreats, our 3-day silent retreats that we did periodically. And then we met once a week. And of course, I would meditate twice a day for 30 minutes, which I still do faithfully. And that I still value so much as such a critical part of expressing wholeness, that it's a part of really getting in touch with my divinity and about loosening these bonds that I have to my ego. So I encourage everybody to embrace it. In fact, I taught a class, an adult education class there at Unity Village, that people would come and take on meditation. And I actually used the book, since Unity doesn't have a lot of great books on this, I used the book Meditation for Dummies, which, even though that really offends a lot of people's sensibilities, I recommend. It really covers the topic very nicely. Anyway, I would have people say, I can't meditate. I can't meditate. And what I would tell them was, well, I feel certain that you can. It's just that you can't do it as well as you would like. And so you may have heard that phrase, anything worth doing is worth doing poorly at first. And so for those of you who've had that experience, and I certainly had that experience myself, when I started meditating, the monkey mind is all over the place. And in addition to which, there's this little part of me, this little productive part of me that's saying, what are you doing? This is the stupidest thing you've ever done. Why are you doing this? And so part of the process of being able to meditate is to being able to stick with it long enough so that you can allow this kind of resistance to calm down a little bit. And you can do it. So one of the challenges that we have in the West is that we're much better thinking about, talking about, and read about than actually doing spiritual practice. So let me share my screen here again. So you can see that that for me, I definitely had this issue. I was much more interested in reading about and thinking about these sophisticated and really deep ideas than actually doing the practice. And I think that's a challenge that a lot of us have. But one of the things I want to remind you about, in the Unity tradition, Charles and Fillmore were very dedicated practitioners of meditation. They called it the silence, but they spent time in the silence every day, long periods of time in the silence. Emily Cady in Lessons in Truth says that you need to practice the silence as if it were a musical instrument, regularly and with dedication. So I encourage you all to do that. So when I think about expressing wholeness, remember, you are whole right now. Breathe with me. Feel that wholeness, that you are human, but you are divine. You're a divine having a human experience. We have an ego, but we not are our ego. So we do our inner work, healing our woundedness, bringing what's unconscious to consciousness, doing our psychotherapy, journaling, however that shows up with us. And we do our transcendental work that helps us to let go of our attachment to the ego, our spiritual practice, and that really gets us in touch with the divine part of ourselves. So that what we're here for is this movement from our small s self to our capital S self, our higher self, our divine self, our Christ consciousness, and the full expression of that. And so I will close with this thought, and that is that you are not a drop in the ocean. You are the entire ocean in a drop. And that's what Rumi reminds us of. So friends, I invite you to remember that always. God bless you.